Hello everyone, this is Asif from Mango Education. Welcome to Hello Educator. Today's episode is from Mango Science Radio and it is from Obuli Chandran on the story of the planet Neptune.
Hi, Mango Science Radio listeners. Obli here. I'm here again to share you an interesting story on the discovery of planet Neptune. Today we know there are 8 planets. Unfortunately, Pluto has been demoted to a dwarf planet status, but nevertheless we know Neptune is a planet today. But that was not always the case. There was a time back when people did not know that a planet like Neptune existed. And what was the reason? The reason is it's too far away and it is faint to be visible to the naked eye. So it wasn't until the invention of the telescope that a planet of that far away could be spotted. And it was in the period in the early 17th century when Galileo was training his telescopes to the skies and looking at different objects. In fact, today there are records that in fact he observed the planet Neptune, but he mistook it for some blue fixed star in the sky. And today we know that, but back then when Galileo made the observations, he did not know he had discovered another planet. So how did the discovery of Neptune, that something that could not be seen with the naked eye, but that could be seen with a telescope, came about? So the history is interesting. And exactly a year after Galileo died, when Galileo died in 1642, and exactly a year later, another genius was born. His name was Newton. So he would eventually go on to bring about revolutionary ideas about the universe, how things behave, how gravity works, how light behaved, so many things. So one of the things that he worked on, and we all remember that he's famous for, is the theory of gravitation, which he published in a book called Principia, the Philosophies of the Natural World, in 1687. So he came up with laws, he came up with equations that would tell how one object would move in the presence of gravity and how objects responded to gravity. So now such a big idea has to be tested. And when you come up with very extraordinary claims, you need to validate it with extraordinary evidences. And people were hurrying up. The scientists, the scientific community was looking after proofs or evidences that they could collect to validate or to prove or disprove whether theory of gravitation by Newton was correct or not. So there were different people trying to do it, and as people were looking to validate Newton's theory of gravity, there were another set of astronomers who were looking up at the night sky, and particularly a very famous astronomer called William Herschel. He discovered the planet Uranus in 1781 using his telescope. So the telescopes were powerful enough back then to see distant objects. So since his discovery of the planet Uranus, people were interested to know how the orbit of Uranus behaved, because the way Newton's theory of gravitation predicts, all the objects in the solar system would have to follow a certain path around the sun if the theory is correct. So they try to apply the same theory of Newton's gravitational theory to predict or to observe the orbit of Uranus. But what they observed is the orbit of Uranus was not regular. Not regular in the sense, in comparison to what Newton's gravitational theory predicted. So imagine, let's say the Uranus is predicted according to Newton's theory of gravity to be in a certain position after a certain period of time. But when you observe, it is not actually in the position where it's supposed to be according to the theory of gravity. Then there is something wrong. You call it irregular. The orbit is irregular. So the scientists were confused. So maybe they thought, maybe the law of gravity put forward by Newton is not universal. It could not be applied to all the objects. Maybe it's locally true, or maybe it's applicable to certain objects. So this irregularity in the orbit of Uranus was detected as early as 1821. So because Uranus takes much longer to move around the sun, so it took several long years to observe this irregularity. But at the same time, there was another line of thought. What if Newton's theory is correct and something else was happening, something that we could not observe was happening? So it was in 1845 that another scientist named Le Verrier, he predicts maybe if there was another planet another object that is further away from Uranus and that is close to Uranus, or that is influencing the orbit of Uranus. So that was a very crazy proposition. There's only one way to know it. So to look for that object, that he thought might be influencing the orbit of Uranus, and that might explain why the orbit of Uranus is irregular. So that was done, and it was a mathematical prediction. He put his equations, put the equations of Newton, and he predicted how the presence of an object could explain the data of Uranus orbit. And in fact, within a year, in 1846, exactly as predicted by Leverrier, the planet Neptune was found, just as in exactly the same position that it was predicted to be, less than 1 degree of difference. Like it was so accurate. It was so accurate in exactly the place where it was supposed to be found. It was found, and it is. In retrospect, today it looks like Neptune planet is there, and we are able to see it in much more resolution using more powerful telescopes like Hubble Space Telescopes. But back then, when the planet Neptune was found, it was nothing short of a sensationalism, because it was sensational to find a planet that was completely predicted mathematically, that could not be seen by the naked eye, and this would come as an extraordinary proof that Newton's theory of gravitation was correct, because it was using his predictions, the mathematical predictions, that we were able to find Neptune. So whenever each planet has its own history of being discovered, and when you learn about Neptune next time, remember this story. I'm glad you learned something from this session, and I'll see you soon again with another interesting story.